Hey guys, here we are with Buddhism. I am trying to do better with the Buddhism than I did with Hinduism and be more consistent with my little quiz questions, but just a reminder to have a little notepad by you, write down 1 through 5. I will intersperse the 5 quiz questions throughout these sections so that you can log into Blackboard and get your attendance for watching these. There might be some links that don't work. If they don't worry about it. I will go over those when we meet on WebEx. But to the extent that they do work, please do check them out. All right, we are in Buddhism. You know I love to make timelines. Hinduism, we didn't have a start date. We know it's before Judaism, so pre-2000 BC. So I generally say about 2500 BC. And with Hinduism, we have no known founder. It's just, if you remember, in Hinduism, it was just this grouping of religions that had a lot in common, particularly the polytheism, the idolatry, that moved around the tribes of that area. Well, Buddhism is a much younger religion. So with Buddhism, I generally use the date of about 500 BC. Because we do have a founder, the Buddha. Now, anytime I talk about the Buddha, that is his title. That's not a name. His historic name is Siddhartha Gautama, but we refer to him as the Buddha. So I might call him Sid, Siddhartha, or the Buddha. That is the historic person who is associated with the founding of Buddhism. Now, if I had my board, I would, of course, make my timeline. I'd have Hinduism as the oldest of the world religions that we still have today. We know Hinduism intersected with Judaism. It develops and spreads in those kind of Old Testament kind of religions, and certainly the early Greek and Roman paganistic, pantheistic, polytheistic religions are expressions of Hinduism and the Hinduistic influence. But come up to about 500 BC, and think about what's going on in the rest of the world. In the Middle East, this is where Israel is declining, and we're going to see by 400, and then certainly by the middle of the 300 BC, the fall of Israel and the rise of the Greeks and then the Romans and all that. Well, in the meantime, Hinduism had spread, or the religions that come to be known as Hinduism had spread east into Asia. And so this is all happening in, the story I'm going to tell you now with the Buddha is happening in what's modern day India, up in the mountains there, in Nepal, and or in that area. And the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is Hindu. And so Buddhism is a reform movement out of Hinduism. So why does Buddhism need reforming? Well, it had become outrageously corrupt. 2,000 years of these priests who have this incredible power. They can do the chants for baldness. They can, help you with fertility problems, help you with love. They control the supernatural. And this caste system where the rich, or the high caste have become very, very wealthy. Even now, if you were able to go to the Hindu temple, which you're not, but someday maybe you will be, you'll see a big board and it will say how much you have to pay for each service. If you want some special blessing on your baby, it's $500 or whatever. If you want a blessing on your new business, it's $1,000. If you want to have these services, you have to pay, because the priests have access to how to do it and the rest of the caste don't. And so it had become so corrupt and so burdensome. And this is going to really influence how Siddhartha governs Buddhism. So philosophically, historically, Buddhism is a reformation of Hinduism. We see this kind of transition from Judaism to Christianity, right? Christianity was saying, we're taking Judaism, but we're updating it with some new beliefs and practices related to the understanding of God, particularly in Christ. That's what Hinduism is what Buddhism is doing with Hinduism. Yeah, we think this is the right way of understanding the world, but we think you've got it really, really wrong on some of the practices, especially those that extort people and put caste systems in place. And so then the Buddha will go about reforming that. So let's take a look at Buddhism, complex religion, and where would we expect to find it? Well, you are obviously looking at Asia. Let me move this down here. And there's two separate maps. One is showing you Mahayana Buddhism. Very likely when you think Buddhism, you're thinking Mahayana Buddhism. You're thinking Zen, Chinese kind of Buddhism. And then so the Mahayana, and we'll look in a bit about the branches of Buddhism. You're familiar with these branches now, Protestant versus Roman Catholic versus Orthodox, or Reform Judaism versus Orthodox Judaism, or Sunni and Shiite. You understand that in big religions, there's different types. Well, that's what's going on here. So we have two basic types. Eventually, I'll talk about a third type. But for now, two types, the Mahayana and the Theravada. And I'll explain what's going on with those. Now, Mahayana, the heart of it is in Tibet and China. But look at my number of Buddhists. That seems really, really low. When we're looking at Muslims, we're talking, over 1 billion people, maybe even up to closer to 2 billion. We're talking about Christians. We're talking about billions of people. So why so few Buddhists? Well, the big problem will be in China. Remember, it had a Buddhistic cultural and religious history up until the end of World War II. So the late 1940s, we get Mao and the rise of communism, a very, very severe type of communism that made all religious practice illegal. Even today, I think only about 25% of Chinese people identify as religious, and of that, not that many identify as Buddhist. So communism did a real number on the numbers of Buddhism, particularly in China, the largest population in the world. If it had remained Buddhist, we'd easily have over a billion Buddhists. Similar story to North Korea, where the Kim dynasty came in the 1950s, and now that's a form of communism that does not permit any religious expression other than the worship of the Kims. So we don't have numbers there. We could do some other calculations. Vietnam and Cambodia both fell to the communists, who also did a similar purge of religious traditions. Now, since then, they have come back to be predominantly Buddhist, but the numbers are quite skewed from this communist purging of religion in this area. So that's why our numbers are really low. It's possible, in fact, very, very likely, that there's actually a lot more Buddhists in the world if we could really get a straight number out of China. All right. I mentioned that that Buddhism is a reform movement out of Hinduism. So what I would like you to do is, somewhere in that notebook of yours, make a table. Remember when we were looking at Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, I had you make a table of things that are distinct about Christianity that we would not see again. Well, now I want you to make a table of, here's what Hinduism had, and here's what Buddhism jettisons. The Buddha is going to come along and kind of clean up Hinduism. He's going to jettison a whole bunch of stuff. And as I go through, we'll try to figure out what those items are. So just for now, put Hinduism in one column, Buddhism in another, and keep track as I remember to tell you what is jettisoned. Well, let's start with the story of who is the Buddha. Now, we'll watch a little video in class together to refresh our story. But this guy, Siddhartha Gautama, he is Hindu. He is born into a high caste Hindu family. And there is a witch doctor, a seer, a prophet, a holy man, whatever you want to call it, from Hinduism, who has made a prophecy to his father. His father is a king in the area. And they told the father, this son of yours is either going to be a great holy man or a great ruler. Well, the father is a king and has a lot of wealth and power, and he has no interest in his son becoming a holy man. You remember what Hindu holy men look like. So he's like, oh no, my kid's just going to be a king. So he decides what he'll do is he'll cloister Sid inside of his house. And sometimes it's called a palace. I don't know how palatial it was. But he says, okay, we're just going to keep Siddhartha inside the palace. He can never go out. He'll be completely satisfied with everything here. So they would bring in food and friends and circuses and entertainers and trying to keep this young man completely happy. But like every teenager or young adult, he gets interested in sneaking out. And, you know, every good Disney movie that involves a princess involves sneaking out. Remember Jasmine? She needs to go out and see a whole new world, have a new beginning, all that stuff. Well, she's not the first one to come up with this. Siddhartha sneaks out, and in his little tour of the real world, he sees 4 terrible things that just scare the socks off him, because he has grown up in luxury, right? He has all the food he needs. He has all the wealth he needs. He has all the social stuff he needs, all the health, everything good. He assumes this is how life is for everybody. And he sneaks out and he sees what are called the 4 sights. He sees a very old man. Now, I'm guessing most of you don't just love going to a nursing home. It just creeps us out, right? Scary. Well, imagine 500 BC, where old people were even scarier, and they're dying right in front of you. So he sees somebody who's all hobbled over with age and just sickly and old. And he's like, holy cow, is that what I have to look forward to? And then he keeps going on his illicit little tour of the village. And he sees a leper. And leprosy is a terrible disease that basically eats away your body parts or causes them to rot off. So it's stinky, it's deforms you or disfigures you. It's pretty gross. And so he sees a leper who's, coming around kind of like a zombie. Zombies, I guess, are the modern day lepers, and that their skin is rotting off and stuff. So it totally scares him. So he's like, what diseases are these that are in the real world? Because he had not had this experience. Then he just sees a dead guy at a funeral. His body's all wrapped up. His family's trying to take him out to the river, and they're going to cremate him and, send him down the river on fire. And they're crying, and he's just horrified. And he realizes, holy cow, all my life, I thought the world was great. I thought everybody lived with all the charms that I live with, but apparently that's not true. So then he sees an ascetic, a Hindu ascetic, and hopefully we've already had our class session on Hinduism where I show you the Hindu holy men. But he sees this Hindu holy man there sitting there, and just checked out and very peaceful. Very tranquil, not bothered by sickness, death, disease, whatever. He's just And so this is appealing to Siddhartha because he's totally shook by seeing the old guy, the dead guy, and the leper guy, the sick guy. And so he makes some conclusions. The first conclusion he makes is there is no such thing as happiness. And Buddhism really hinges on this understanding of reality. Remember, the Buddha, Siddhartha, he believes that the world is great. He is born and raised into privilege, into luxury, has never encountered suffering and misery like this. And so then he goes out and is overwhelmed by the level of suffering and misery and starts to believe, I have been duped, and I thought the world was a happy place. That's an illusion. He's completely disillusioned. Now think about a time when maybe you were disillusioned. You thought things were one way and it turned out they were another way. Maybe you thought you were dating a really great guy and it turned out he's a schmuck, and you're just like totally disillusioned. Like, how did I not see that? And so it can really shake you and your sense of reality. So this is what happens in the 4 sights to the Buddha. So he says all happiness is just an illusion. It's a facade. It's not real. If you think you're happy, he says, you're just like me. You're just deluded. You just haven't seen reality yet. Now, this should sound a lot like Hinduism. Remember, in Hinduism, existence is suffering. They understood that to be alive is to suffer. The Buddha didn't quite get that because he had been protected from the realities of life. But then he figured it out after he did his little tour of the city. So the Buddha goes on. He's married, and at that point where he's so disillusioned, he's like, I can't live like this. Happiness is not even real. It's an illusion. The only guy I saw out there who had any sense of peace and tranquility at all was the holy man, the ascetic. So he does what Hindu holy men do. He renounces family life, leaves all of his stuff, and heads out to the forest to sit there in the forest with some other holy men and meditate and just try to become enlightened. Just give up all physical life and just focus on being liberated from physical existence. And he was plagued by physical desires, sexual desires, desire for food, desire for sleep, comfort, all these things. And so he was very austere with himself, and he would, he would never let himself fully sleep because he didn't want to have any sexual urges. He did not, so in order to do that, he would squat in very prickly bushes so that you could never really sleep. You'd always get prickled. He only would eat 1 grain of rice a day, and obviously you don't live too long if you practice like that. And eventually he's really harming himself with these very severe practices of not eating, not sleeping. And he and some of his other holy men guys, they're walking around, and it's in the rainy season, and he is crossing a river. And the current is pretty swift, and he kind of faints, and he almost drowns. And so his holy men friends grab him out of the river, and they plunk him under a tree on the riverbank. And they're like, dude, you can't go with us anymore. You're going to die, and then you'll haunt us. Your ghost will, in Hinduism and Buddhism, they have real worries about spirits, and so they didn't want him around if he's going to die on them. So they're like, you have to stay here. And so the Buddha says, I will sit under this tree, and I'll either die under this tree or I'll be enlightened under this tree. And so the story is he sits under this tree for 49 days in the rainy season. And in that time, this giant cobra comes around and encircles him, and then comes up and spreads his hood over the head of the Buddha like a huge umbrella to shade him from these torrential rains. Now, someday I'm going to write a book called That Damn Snake. Because in Hinduism, Vishnu, the god of destruction, his animal sidekick is a snake. Certainly we understand the role of the serpent in the Christian and the Jewish stories. And here's that damn snake showing up, and he is the guardian of the enlightenment of the Buddha. So if you ever do see a book in the bookstore that's called That Damn Snake, please buy it. It's probably by me, and you'll be the only people to ever buy it. So do your part. All right. So he's sitting under this tree. It's called a Bodhi tree, and he's there for 49 days during this torrential rain. And eventually he's in a trance. He's doing meditation, and he's in a trance, and eventually he ascends through past his physical existence, past his mental existence, past his past existences, and he finally becomes fully enlightened. And that is when he takes on the name the Buddha. The Buddha in Pali, that's the language that they used, just means the enlightened being. Now, he, at that point, says, oh, now I understand how to escape existence so that we don't have to suffer. Now I understand how to stop the suffering and stop being so unhappy and just, become enlightened. But instead of doing what other Hindu holy men do, which was to extract from society, he goes, I got to go tell people. And so he does things a little differently. He starts teaching his way. He calls it the middle way. Now, the middle way is in contrast to the way of extreme asceticism that we find in the Hindu holy men tradition. Hindu holy men, as you might remember, if we've already had our class by this time, they starve themselves, beat themselves, harm themselves, everything to purge themselves of physicality and to be somehow released into a spiritual existence. Well, he's like, heck, that didn't work. He says, eating too much is bad, but not eating enough is also bad. Either way, all I'm thinking about is food. I'm craving food. Too much sleep is bad, not enough sleep is bad. Too much comfort's bad, but not enough comfort's bad. So he says, let's not be extreme. Let's not do this asceticism of Hinduism. Let's adopt a middle way. And as we move through the life and practice of monks, you'll see that it is quite different from the life and practice of Hindu holy men. So on your Buddhism versus Hinduism sheet, Hinduism promotes asceticism. Their highest holy man ideal is this very ascetic life. In Buddhism, the Buddha rejects asceticism and in favor of the middle way. All right, question number 1, willow. Now, so just write down willow for number 1. I'm going to watch the little link on this YouTube or this video about the life of Buddha with you in class, so don't worry about that. All right, I think we've done a lot of, he's sitting under the tree, we got that, and he becomes enlightened. In his enlightenment, so what does he realize in his enlightenment? Well, he realizes why we exist. He realizes the nature of existence, and he calls that the Four Noble Truths. And so I'll get to the Four Noble Truths. But so he goes, the rest of his life, he goes around teaching, here's the nature of existence, and here's how you can cease to exist in the Four Noble Truths. And then he goes out, teaches, gets followers, disciples who hear his teaching, like his system, and follow him. And then eventually, after about 40 years of ministry, he dies about the age of 80. So this idea of this teacher, this religious or spiritual teacher going out, getting disciples, Jesus is not the only guy who uses this model. Buddha is 500 years before Christ, and this is his model of passing on his teaching and practice. Now, last words are generally considered kind of important, and purportedly his last words to his disciples, I think they're pretty telling. Work out your own liberation with diligence. This idea of liberation should remind you of moksha. It's the exact same word. Remember, this is just Hinduism done Buddhist way. And so he says, you can be liberated from existence if you try. And he's going to give them a system for how to do that. But clearly, you're on your own. You got to do this, work it out yourself. And it's going to be hard. You're going to have to be diligent. All right. Question number 2, lamp. At that point, there are Buddhist practitioners who have studied under the Buddha. They go and they start telling others about their system. Now, do remember, this is in a Hindu area. So the Hindus are already thinking like this. They already understand existence is suffering, and we've got to have some system of getting out. And Hinduism, remember, it's not creedal. There's no prohibition on the way that the Buddha is suggesting to release oneself from existence. It's all the same. Follow whichever guru you want. And so there's no opposition to this new teacher coming around. And so Buddhism becomes quite popular. It also becomes very popular because a lot of Hindu people are tired of the corruption of the Hindu high caste. And so those priests and some of the other high caste Hindus have extorted people. And it's very, very expensive to get anything done. You know, if you want services, if you want any help at all from the religious leaders, you got to pay. And so when the Buddha comes along, it's like, no, you shouldn't have to pay for any of that, and we shouldn't be corrupt, and we shouldn't be doing all these awful things. It becomes a pretty popular message. And so Buddhism spreads over most of Asia at that point. And eventually, particularly in China, these wealthy landowners hear this message, and they believe it would be auspicious for their farms if they host a monastery on the farm, or their lands. And so you have these vast acres of land that some wealthy noble has, and he builds them a monastery, and then he's the patron of that monastery. And so in that way, huge monasteries, some of these monasteries had thousands of monks living there, doing Buddhist practice, and the idea was it brought good fortune to that guy who was the landowner. Buddhism, for the most part, it's never been a political movement. They were not empire-ish, and Buddhism, by definition, is very introspective, very pacifistic. So we don't have a history of Buddhism going out and conquesting a religious empire. It spread through teaching, and it spread through people who were kind of Hindu-ish, adopting the system of the Buddha. All right, I'm going to stop this section there. And so far you have 2 questions answered. All right, see you in a moment.